Dr. Gray, my question is kind of two parts, and I think you helped answer one of them. The first part is what, you talked about wet and dry canals. With the Canal Pro Apex Locator, what do you find, like what is the ideal scenario for getting the most accurate results for the Canal Pro? Is it more dry? Is it more wet? Can you just elaborate on that?
I haven't seen any difference between a wet or a dry canal with the Canal Pro. The difference comes is if you have fluid that, say you've got a millimeter worth of fluid in your chamber, there's no Apex locator on the market that's going to give you an accurate reading there, because what happens is the fluid that's in the chamber is basically kind of grounding the whole system out. And so that was the problem that the Root CXs, had, was that any excess fluid, if they communicated from one canal to the exit, threw the machine off, and that's why it automatically zeroed, and that's why that wave went all the way down and jumped around all the time. So I've measured in dry canals, I've measured in canals with heme, I've been able to measure in canals that have heme in the chamber, but as long as the heme that's in the chamber isn't communicating, say, with the palatal root or the palatal canal, and there's not a joining of that, it still works very accurately. It's just when you get so much fluid in the chamber that it communicates with all the different canals, that's when you can't do that. And that's easy to eliminate. You just rinse and dry and bam, away you go. So I haven't noticed any difference in accuracy between a dry canal or a moist canal.
So you don't specifically add, sodium hypochlorite or anything before you take your working one. It's just whatever's there.
Nope. Okay. So my protocol, 8, 10, 15 hand file, clean it out, get as much tissue out of the way as I can, rinse, dry. I drop straight in with my 10, 25 length file, and I get my measurements that early. And then from there, I rock and roll.
Okay. And then I guess the second part.
Yep.
The second part of the question is, a lot of times, a doctor might say, hey, I'm having trouble getting accurate readings with my Apex locator. We talked about recalibration. We talked about making sure there's no fluid in the pulp chamber. Is there anything else we can suggest to doctors that say, hey, try this and see if it, you get an accurate reading the next time?
I'm sorry, I missed your question a little bit. Can you, what is it?
Yeah, so sometimes we'll get a question from a doctor say, hey, my Apex locator seems to be inaccurate. I feel like I didn't get a good accurate reading. And so then we say, well, did you try this? Did you try that? You mentioned making sure you recalibrate every time you use it with every tooth. You talked about you want to make sure that there's no fluid in the pulp chamber. But are there any other tips you can give us that might be throwing off the reading besides those two things?
Yeah, the size of the file that the doctor is using. If they're using a number 6 or number 8 file to try to get a reading on an immature tooth where the canal is wide open, they're not having enough contact to the file. So if you're getting an inaccurate reading or you don't feel like you're getting a good reading size, go up one size in your file. So if you're using an 8, go up to a 10, and then you'll probably find a smoother, accurate reading. I used to do that with the Root CX all the time. When it was bouncing around, I knew that the foramina was larger than what the file tip size was. So if I went from a 10 to a 15 file to where more of the file occupied the foramina, it tended to calm down and it tended to give me a more accurate reading. So that would be my very first thing to tell them. Go up one size in file. And always use a 25 length, because you want more file coming out of the tooth so you can get an accurate reading. So I never measure with a 21. It's always a 25.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you.
Other questions?
Dr. Gray, Ryan out here in California. How are you, sir?
Hey, buddy. How are you?
Good, good. Quick question. A lot of great information, learning a lot, so I appreciate it. And you dove deep into the apical constriction versus apical foramina. Now, what's the end result if the doctor ends the root canal therapy at the apical foramina versus the apical constriction?
Death by hanging.
Death by hanging. I like it. Are you going to end up doing a retreatment or end up doing pulling the tooth at some point?
I'm going to leave it the way that it is. And part of the reason we use gutta percha today is because gutta percha is an inert material. You know, do we get things beyond the apex? Absolutely we do. You know, we get sealer beyond the apex, a little bit of gutta percha beyond the apex. The body's a wonderful machine in the sense that it can adapt and overcome quite easily. So if I have a little bit of gutta percha, you know, past that apex that I would personally like to see, I'm going to leave it, especially if it's asymptomatic. I can't tell you the thousands of cases that I have seen in my career where I've had an overextended root canal that is completely healed, completely asymptomatic with no issues. Now, if I get an overextended root canal that's still staying symptomatic, then I'm going to either have to consider a surgical approach or a retreatment approach. And the way I determine what I do is what type of materials in the inside of the canal. I can look at x-rays and pretty much know, is this a solid core thermophil case or is it gutta percha? And if it's a solid thermophil case, I'm going to retreat it because it's the carrier that's beyond the apex that's causing the irritation. And once I can pull that plastic carrier out of the way, life becomes good again. So those cases I retreat. If it's symptomatic and I know it's gutta percha, then my only option traditionally is to go in and surgically treat the tooth.
Got it. Thank you.
Other questions? Cool. I guess we baffled them again. That's awesome.
No, I think some of the questions
Okay.
got answered, I think, in the session. Oh, did someone have?
Yeah, I heard one more.
One more, Rick. So
yeah.
Obviously, when we're out in the field selling these, we're up against the Root ZX. They own the market. So it's either we're selling against Root ZX usually or to a doctor that is not using an apex locator yet. So how do we sell against the Root ZX when doctor's comfortable with the Root ZX? He's used it since school. You know, is our main selling strategy that, you know, the Canal Pro doesn't jump around like the Root ZX, or is there any more ammo you can give us?
Well, I'll tell you what worked in my hands, just having one show up in my office. You guys have heard me, and Ryan, you've heard me tell the story. When Amy sent me the Canal Pro, it sat on my, you know, cabinet for about 3 months. And part of the problem is that I was a third generation Root ZX person from day one. I knew when the instrument was behaving, and I knew when it was misbehaving, and I pretty much knew how to overcome when it was misbehaving. And the problem with the Root ZX is that it misbehaves quite a bit. Now the Root ZX changed to the Root ZX2, and most of the endodontists hated the Root ZX2 because the impedance has changed. And so we actually had more accuracy problems, and that's why they developed that little mini Root ZX, because that little mini Root ZX had the same setup as the original Root ZX, and that's why today the endodontist community loves the original Root ZX or that little mini, because it has kind of a more accurate thing. In my hands, what basically had happened was I was so consistent that I was afraid to use a new system and maybe my consistency would change. And it really wasn't until Amy had kind of said, enough's enough, are you going to try this? And so I did. And so on my first patient, I tried it, and I was kind of blown away by how smooth it was, and it wasn't jumping around. Now the whole key is that my lip clips, my file clips, all that stuff that I had from 4 Root ZXs in my office were all interchangeable with the Canal Pro. So I did not have to run out and buy a bunch of new lip clips, and I didn't have to run out and buy a bunch of new file clips and all these other things, because everything I had from my Root ZX interchanged and worked perfect with the Canal Pro. So the first case I did, it went right down real smooth. I loved the feedback, and I thought, okay, let me take my master cone fit. I was dead on. I felt comfortable, finished the case. I liked how it looked. So then I said to myself, the second case, let's, this is all in one day. Let's try it on the next patient. And again, was amazed at how smooth it really went. And so after the second case, that's when I put the rest of my Root CXs up. And now instead of having 4 Root CXs in my office, I only have 1 Canal Pro. So God forbid that Canal Pro dies, because then I'm going to be miserable. But the whole key was having a demo unit that I actually used. And so I know that this is a big expense for most offices to go, well, am I going to drop that kind of coin on a brand new device that's not tested in my hands? So, if you have an opportunity that you have a demo and you agree to leave it with a provider for a week or whatever days with the promise that they'll use it, that's probably the best way for them to do it, is just to get it in their hands and let them play with it. If they'll actually give you time that you could show them on the demo mock-ups how smooth and how easy it is, that's probably the easiest way to do this. And personal testimony, of course, always helps, but that's what worked for me, was actually physically having the unit in my hand and actually using it, not just letting it collect dust on my shelf.
Great info, thank you.
Any other questions, guys and girls? Well, cool. Well, let me turn the time back over to Amy then. And then if you have questions, hit me up. Most of you know my email address. You've got my, you can shoot me a text. Whatever works for you is fine for me. It's not like I have a whole lot going on right now. I'm just kind of getting fat, sitting here at the house and growing my beard out, right?
Exactly.
Well, thank you, Dr. Gray, for all those hints and tips and information. I think everyone's getting a lot of good use out of these workshops and taking away some new information that they can use when they go back out in the field. And so with that, I'd like to say everyone have a great weekend. Our next topic we're looking at is probably the basics of hand files. So we'll I'll post that next week and send the invites out. And as always, if you have questions you want to make sure are answered in the presentation, send them to me ahead of time. But we also take questions during the sessions. So have a great weekend.